Yep. Good. Is it on? Yep. Okay, so welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate you taking the time to come out and engage in this conversation, very important conversation, I might add, about a project we've dubbed CodePIQUA. And CodePIQUA is about looking at our zoning and subdivision regulations and our transportation planning documents to make sure we're responding to those things that the community told us were important in the comprehensive plan update in 2007 and subsequent planning exercises. So one of the things that we heard very clearly was that community image and identity are things that we want to do a better job with. And one of the recommendations out of the zoning or the comprehensive plan was that we take a look at our zoning and subdivision regulations and other tools to see if they're up to speed with delivering the results and outcomes that folks in the community desire. So that's what this exercise is about. In addition to that, there were a number of remarks about transportation and traffic control related issues, truck routes, why are trucks on certain streets, those kind of things. So that too is something that we'll be discussing as part of this project. That will result in the creation of a transportation plan, a master transportation plan, a thoroughfare plan, if you will, which is something that we've not had in our community in the past, so it's a tool that we definitely need. I'm Chris Schmeezing. I'm the city planner with the city of Piqua, for those of you who don't know me. And again, I welcome you here, and I'm glad you're all here this evening. So I'm going to use this handheld for just a minute. Just so you know, we are recording this as part of the project. We've got a website where we're going to continue to post information about the happenings of this project. So we thought it would be useful to record this public session so that we can put that out there for folks, and they can gain the same insights and learn about the information the same as you will this evening. So the process we've embarked on really is kicking off now. This week, our consultant arrived in town, and we helped them to become familiar with the community. We took them around to the different neighborhoods and showed them the lay of the land, so to speak. And then we've engaged in a series of stakeholder meetings. So yesterday we had 4 stakeholder meetings, different groups representing different viewpoints. Today there were 6 more, and then the public meeting this evening. And there's a couple more discussions tomorrow. And most of that is citizens, residents of the community, business leaders, folks who work for various organizations, individuals just like you, along with city staff and the technical expertise that comes from those folks. So with all of that information combined, we'll be giving our consultants some direction on here are the things that we think we need to take a closer look at. So with that said, tonight is primarily informational. We have with us Code Studio, who is the consultant we've engaged for this project. I'm going to hand it off to Lee here in just a second. Before I do that, I'd just like to acknowledge Gary Huff, our city manager, and thank him for being here this evening. Gary has been instrumental in allowing us as staff to push forward with these kind of projects that need to happen to help our community reach the goals that you all desire for us to reach. So this is important stuff. And so again, I'm glad you're here to participate. So with that, Lee, I'm going to hand it off to you, and Lee will take it from here. You'll have to excuse me. There is a boys varsity basketball game this evening, which I don't mind missing the game, but as it turns out, it's senior night, so I feel as though I probably ought to be there. So I'm going to excuse myself here in just a few minutes. So if you see me walk out, that's why. So thank you again.
Actually, he's not admitting that I'm dreadfully boring in person. So my name is Lee Einsweiler. Our company's name is Code Studio. Colin Scarf is walking around in the background here with the camera. He's my business partner. We started the firm in 2006, and most of what we do is exactly this kind of project. We're going to talk a little bit tonight about the goals and objectives for the project, a little bit about our team that we brought together, our approach to the project, how we're going to get this work done and over what period of time. a little bit about how we think about coding and approach those ideas, a little bit about mobility. Our next big exercise in the community is what we call the Charrette Week. So we're going to show you how that might work and how you can be engaged during that period. And afterwards, we'll have a little discussion and maybe a little question and answer. At minimum in person, given the number of people that are here, we can just simply form a little circle and have a cup of coffee and finish off the conversation. So a couple of things. As objectives for this project, first off, we're not starting from scratch. We're not bringing something from Troy. We're not bringing something from Austin, Texas, where my office is. We are creating something based on the findings of all the prior planning exercises that have taken place here. It is our intent to engage the community throughout the project. This is one of those first opportunities. We intend to implement the comprehensive plan for the community and figure out if we are now 10 years out from the plan, whether some revision might be necessary. If we need a little new direction, we'll be talking to the community for that. We're going to update the zoning and subdivision regulations. That's one of the key deliverables. The other key deliverable is a transportation plan that is sensitive to the various kinds of places there are across the entire city here. Some of the key outcomes, clearly the notion of the small town feel here, the quality of construction that was originally employed in this community and ought to be carried forward as we move forward, in the opportunity to sort of celebrate the places and spaces that you already have, enhancing that sense of community pride is one of the key outcomes we'd like to see. We'd like to also, however, provide a more sustainable future for the community. And that means enhancing and encouraging the opportunity for revitalization of the existing community, providing improvements that meet the needs of new residents. Many of us are aging baby boomers, and we are headed towards downsizing out of our houses, et cetera. Where are those opportunities here, and how do we make sure they're being provided in the right number? Ensuring and supporting the growth and prosperity of the business community in town. I've bought a few cups of coffee already, and I've bought a few beers as well. I hope I can admit that on camera. Finding ways to prompt reinvestment within our neighborhoods by the folks who are already living there. Improving the livability, and here we're talking about the connections and other kinds of things that the transportation network provides, especially thinking about those elements of mobility beyond the car. So the bike network, the pedestrian network, and how that can actually promote livability for the residents who are here. Our project timeline, in the first period, you are here right at the very start at this kickoff. We'll be preparing both a memo describing a proposed approach to outreach now that we've visited and have some sense of how we might conduct our outreach over the course of the whole project. We'll be preparing a memo that describes what we think of from a best practice perspective of your existing regulations and your existing materials that provide your transportation planning. We're going to move into that charrette exercise in which we're all going to work together to kind of design a strategy and some solutions for some of the challenges that we see, some land use concepts, some transportation concepts will come out of that. We'll check in with the community on those and ensure that we're on the right track before we get to the drafting. And then we'll get into the drafting. We'll draft in 3 key pieces because you don't want all of this all at once because it's a pretty big document. So we'll do it in thirds and come back to the community each time and talk about those. And as we close in on the end, we're actually going to test the code. We'll be back to actually try designing some projects on some real sites so that we can show you what the code will produce, make sure that that is the kind of thing the community is looking for. We'll revise the code based on that testing exercise, and it'll go into the formal adoption process with us presenting at a joint workshop. At that stage, really Chris and the staff here are picking up the ball and running with it. So we're sort of fading into the background as we get towards the adoption, and the local staff is then moving forward to bring that document through the adoption process. Our project team includes myself and Colin that are here tonight. David Gamble, who's worked with you on the Lock 9 Park and some of the other activity down here towards the riverfront. David is an old buddy of ours who actually got us excited about this project, called us up and said, look, you know, this thing's come out from one of my client communities. I think we need to do this. And so we've brought David on board with our team. We're also bringing from Nelson Nygaard, a very good transportation mobility firm, Maricel Font, who is going to come join us during the Charrette Week and help us with some things like the truck routing and the bike network and some of those other elements of mobility that we'll be looking for. Our code experience across the country is fairly vast. This is a selection of that experience just to give you some sense. The names come all the way from the West Coast to the East Coast, from the North to the South. I've personally been doing this now over 30 years. So for a long time, I've been engaged in conversations about zoning and especially about revitalization of communities. We've done a lot of small area planning work as well. This is kind of the challenge of looking at particular things like corridors, downtowns. Here, one of your challenges might be the mall site. There are some other challenges in the community that are particular land use areas that are going to need a conversation at some point and probably need new zoning at the same time. In general, our firm believes in a sort of new and modern approach to zoning that focuses on walkability, that focuses on predictability in the outcomes, both for the staff, the applicant, the neighbor. All of those involved in the process should find the outcomes predictable. And we firmly believe in mixed-use development. I think one of the things that has happened over time here in Piqua is we've got, you know, this over here and this over there and this over there, and we haven't thought to blend some of those things together. And now that we're coming back to do that, it's a real challenge. It's a struggle, for example, to put residential into the upper stories of downtown. It's not quite happening yet, even though we all know it's possible. So focusing in a little bit on some of those mixed-use ideas. Typically, the reason that we're hired is a community is calling for some level of change. If they wanted the same old thing, they don't need our firm. So there's a call for change. We believe that change is typically best handled when it's a market-driven response. The market and our regulations have to be working together, because if we're working against the market, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. So that's kind of our general approach to how we think about zoning. When you think about zoning in its sort of old school Euclidean version, it was all about separation of use. It was all about making sure that a tannery was not your next door neighbor for your single family house, right? So we separated things. We said this goes over here, that goes over there. And what that did was lead us to this Los Angeles sprawling model of separation of use that demands enormous infrastructure to service it, because we're moving long distances in between all of our various pieces of our day. We end up with auto-dominated landscapes. This is an image of one of the corridors in our own Austin, Texas. Those auto-dominated landscapes can be resurrected. The public realm here is a very dangerous one. Imagine walking down this sidewalk, the light poles and the driveways and all of that. This is what we call the public realm, the space that interacts between the private development and the street. This is the exact same site. And admittedly, it's a fairly intense new building, but it is in Austin and not here in Piqua. But the public realm is now a wide sidewalk separated from the street. There are no driveways here anymore. The entrance is down the side street and into the parking structure associated with this project. So a very different change in feel and a change in focus and thinking about how we should be treating those public pieces. You have a fabulous downtown. This is just a modern version of a great downtown, is all. Most of these places that we created with our old regulations when we were separating things had no sense of place because, of course, we were creating a monoculture of one thing there. And in many cases, they were either about cars or perhaps when they were about people, you got an exciting place. But the two never were successfully planned together at the time. The outcomes were unpredictable. So this is an example in which I stood and looked in one direction at the site on my right, and that site is a self-storage facility. No windows, blank wall, parking between the building and the street. I turned around and looked at the building on the next adjacent site, and I saw this lovely little, what is actually a day surgery facility with a retail ground floor and upper story offices in it. If I was the guy who ran this, I'm not sure I'd be thrilled to have public storage, my next door neighbor. Now, admittedly, it's a pretty good looking public storage building, but the predictability of the system about use, also about quality of development, about the relationship of the person on the street to the building, all of those need to kind of get squared away and be consistent for people to feel comfortable and feel like you've got a great environment. So this new approach to zoning is, no matter what, much more visual. This is some work from Knoxville. We are talking about combining ideas for the building on the private property and ideas for the street itself. And here we'll be bringing together the zoning and the subdivision regulations so we can talk about those things in tandem, the land use and the transportation. This is an example of an old code. It's been a little bit updated with this little pasted in graphic that was built on the internet. But typically these codes now are visually oriented and graphic. This is one of our codes as an example from one of our client communities with an illustration of what the area might look like with lot standards, building placement standards, and height regulations, providing a much easier way to understand what the rules produce. The tables have the rules, but many people can't read those tables and imagine what that might be. So giving them this kind of a visual code. The other thing is when you write for the attorneys, as probably this code was originally written by the legal profession for the legal profession, then that's the kind of conversation you get instead of the design conversation that you wanted to have that happens when you have a visually oriented code. Most times, these kinds of new codes focus on planning, and by that, I mean on plan implementation, taking ideas about parks, about other kinds of spaces, taking conversations with the community and turning those into regulatory approaches. That's what we're seeing in many of these newer kinds of codes. There is also a focus on this public realm concept. Now, this is little old me, a few pounds lighter, and about 15 years ago in Peoria, Illinois. And yes, that place is called Beast Island U. The streetscape here is not very appealing, right? I can walk on this sidewalk. It's wide enough for just me. If I was walking with someone else, we'd have a little bit of trouble. And in fact, directly ahead, I'm about to conk into a pole, luckily turned into a barber pole so that maybe it's a little brighter than usual, right in front of me. This is a lovely little street through a tiny neighborhood commercial area in Peoria, Illinois. So if we stop and think about this and we think about the kinds of improvements that can be made, managing what's happening with our utilities, expanding the sidewalk, putting in street lighting, getting street trees in place, parking on street to protect me as the person walking down the street from the traffic in the street, then we begin to see the private investment responding and investing themselves. So the public realm that you just saw, none of that was done by the private developer until we got to the last slide. All those other improvements are typically a civic responsibility. They are perhaps done during subdivision, major subdivision, but otherwise, these kinds of improvements are under the guidance of the city. And Main Street here is a great example of it, right? Or the bump outs that were done by the Y, or any of those kinds of placemaking improvements that you have done are about the public realm. And improving the public realm is the way to improve the walkability and the functionality of your community. So if we think about this in terms of the tools that we usually use, when we make a zoning map, typically everything commercial is red. So here's red on a zoning map. This is also red on a zoning map. If we care whether we get this or this, we actually need some more rules, right? Because they're both red on the zoning map. So what are we talking about in order to get the kind of environment we see on the right? How do we regulate our way towards a better community? Form. We manage the form of development. Not every little architectural detail, but the general placement of buildings, etc. So in here, we're looking at building placement right up to the street. We actually create a lot of curiosity as you're walking past the shop. You're looking in, you might stop in if you see something interesting. You might come back a couple of weeks later because you saw something interesting, but that interaction is there between the pedestrian and the business. In addition, of course, in this case, we've got some sidewalk dining embedded here, so you might actually have a lot of interest in being out and involved on the street. Here's some building placement that just wasted a whole lot of money, because where is the person who's going into the leather store back here in the back? They're on the little sidewalk way back in there, and they walked there across the parking lot from their car maybe. Who's out here on this sidewalk? They're not interacting with the store at all. They might know there's a leather goods shop since there's a big sign on it, but really there's no interaction there. And we've doubled up the amount of infrastructure we have to have. I don't know who the benches are for. We need the benches out in front of the leather goods store so the wife can go inside and shop around and the husband can sit on the little bench, right? What we always see. So this kind of building placement has led us to waste a lot of money on infrastructure. Parking location is also critically important. This is just a simple townhouse development, but I'm not letting my kid ride down this street because they're going to get run over by somebody backing out or coming into their garage or even parking on the pad here. So the same form, admittedly in this case a little more historic looking, the same form with the parking behind creates a great street edge, right? It's a whole different feel to this version than this version. So simple things like how do we manage the location of parking are critical. Building height. So sometimes when we regulate things, we get into this very, very narrow specification world that leads to this. The battleship approach to building height in which everybody is maximizing, right? Everybody's wanting to be up to the tallest height possible. Whereas here, if we regulate in stories, here's 3 stories, here's 3 stories that's actually taller, this one's taller than this one, this is 2 stories. There's a little bit of mix and match going along the streetscape. And actually also by empowering the individual property owners of a little slice of this, by empowering that property owner to do their own development, we're going to get a more varied outcome than we do when we use the master developer model that you're seeing here. This is the kind of thing that might come if you replace the mall with something new, for example. This is the kind of thing that might come there because this is a pattern you see nowadays. But really the original traditional patterns look much more like this. If we walk up and down Main Street or any of the side streets here in the downtown area, you see a much more varied streetscape. So building height's an element there. One of the main things about building height is you can't have differences that are so extreme they significantly impact value. This little white house now either has to become a 4-story mixed-use building or maybe an attorney's office or something else. Because living in it as a house and having that out your side window is a little much. So the mixing and matching of heights and uses, still something we have to be fairly careful about. So the making of a zoning map that's allocating height and allocating uses is an important process in terms of minimizing those adverse conditions, one thing to another thing. Windows and doors. This one is just so brain dead simple. Of course we put windows and doors on buildings, right? Every single time, except sometimes not. Often in an auto-oriented environment, we do the simplest thing, which might be to create a blank wall. This blank wall might be on the side of a grocery store because there's a bank of coolers there. It could also be, as it is in this case, a parking garage, and it's just framing a parking garage. We have great building materials, but I'm not going to walk on the sidewalk over there. It's not going to be a very comfortable environment for me. It's not inviting or interesting. I guess if I have to get from work to my car, I might, but otherwise I'm going to avoid that place. Use ideas are changing as well. Once upon a time, what would we have had upstairs here? Probably a residential use. Now it might be an office use, perhaps. But we're going to have different uses on upper stories and ground floors. We need to begin to think about that now, even in outlying areas where we're building brand new buildings. What might those be if they were multi-story? So we're doing vertical zoning now, thinking about multiple floors of use. Public spaces, absolutely critical to the quality of life of the citizenry, is embedding those great public spaces that we all enjoy so much. You guys are working on that Lock 9 Park being a great example of a future fabulous public space. Streets is one of the final big discussions that we need to have. This street carries an immense amount of traffic into downtown DC, this is Alexandria, and back out again. And yet, it's a street that's possible to walk across. Why? Because there's a median. It's a street that has cars on the non-peak hour side, and we actually manage those cars and move them over to the other side later on in the day. So thinking about how we design and manage our streets to make them more successful is a really important point. The easiest way to talk about complete streets is right here. So this is Mother Nature's answer to moving water from point A to point B. And you get a lot of ecosystem services and all those kinds of things out of this. This is habitat. This is all kinds of other things in this picture. It's water cleansing. It is, it's a place where wildlife lives. It's a lot of things all together. This is an engineer's model for how to effectively move water from one place to another. And it does a fabulous job, but it's because we only asked them to do one thing, move water from point A to point B. And this has no other functions. And in fact, because it doesn't have any of those other functions, it's actually dysfunctional to provide this kind of a system. So when we talk about those streets, think about how we can make a street function more like a stream, more like a multimodal facility, place and room for all multiple functions, not just a single function. So right now, we build this thing to facilitate travel over long distances. If we had travel over a short distance associated with this, we wouldn't need all of these lanes, et cetera. This is for significant travel. A multimodal street is more about servicing what is adjacent to it. This street is accommodating walkers on both sides of the street. It's accommodating a very sophisticated level of bike infrastructure. It is accommodating parking, which is buffering the bike lane, and it's still accommodating traffic on the street. So all the modes are here, but this is functioning a little more like the stream than this one is, which is functioning like that wide open channel that you saw. So when we talk about things here in Piqua and we say, they're driving too fast down my street, that's just not likely to be an issue on this street, and I guarantee it's an issue on this one, right? The design makes a big difference, and the friction created by having those multiple modes accommodated is what we're talking about. The city's already dipping their toe into this, certainly the improvements on Main Street and other locations in town. Up and coming is your first roundabout. That'll be a fascinating process to watch as people learn how to use the roundabout and find out that actually it is probably a fairly efficient way to move people through that intersection. So one of the other things is when we talk about bikes, we often get kind of caught up. There's a variety of bikers out there, from the full-on spandex head-down guys at this end of the spectrum on down to the folks out on the weekend with their children with them, right? And everything in between. So thinking hard about how to design bicycle infrastructure and accommodate both that commuting trip, right, on the one hand, but also the recreational trip on the other. So as we begin to talk about the bike system here, how do we make sure we're accommodating all the possible eventualities in terms of our bicycle infrastructure? The end result of all of this conversation is really, if you can help us describe the thing we want, if this picture is representative of what I want again, then the picture on the left is how I regulate that thing, so that we all know what our outcomes are going to be. Clear, predictable results. If you want this building, whether you like these or not, or their architecture or not, you can describe something and you can code for it. That's really what we're talking about in this project, is the community helping us describe what we would like to see in the future, and us helping you code for it. So just a little bit about some of our next steps. The next big step is something we call our Charrette Week. We'll be here with our full team. There'll be 6 or 8 of us here in addition to the local staff. Heaven knows we might even get some people from the Regional Planning Commission to come over and others to help support us. But a multi-day collaborative design and planning workshop that is one of the ways we can most efficiently get input from stakeholders without burning them out by having meeting after meeting after meeting. So this up and coming one might look a little bit like this. We'll show up on Sunday night. We'll begin to take our new community, our new team members on a tour through the community. We'll meet with the technical committee of city staff and kind of check in one last time. We'll run an open house workshop exercise on Monday night. We'll get some new ideas. We'll bring some ideas to the table. We'll combine as a group to see what needs to be changed about our thinking, see what needs to be investigated further, what needs to be designed more, what needs to be illustrated more, and have that conversation. And the team will be working over the next couple of days through Thursday late afternoon to design some kinds of things and to help fill out that strategy for what we're going to do. In the meantime, like the last couple of days, we also are going to touch base with our stakeholders again on a parallel track that's happening. We usually do this in a space that is like a downtown storefront or something similar, a place where people can drop in and sort of see what's happening, have a look at the drawings that are being made, comment on things as they move along, express their own particular special interests if they've got them. So this is a very open, collaborative exercise, which will lead in the end to, we hope, a transportation plan map and some idea of where the zoning is headed, what kinds of districts we might need, what kinds of regulations might be in place, how we might think about splitting the community up from the zoning perspective. So here's each of those pieces sort of visually. The hands-on session is normally a citizen exercise at facilitated tables. A member of our team facilitates the conversation. The conversations are often quite wide-ranging, and they may differ vastly from table to table, but that's quite all right. That has to do with the personalities involved and their own personal interests in the community. The most important thing is we get back an awful lot of information about the community, and especially when we do the report back at the end, we see, and the community sees, where we're in alignment. And it almost doesn't matter who we've had at all the various tables, there's going to be a lot of alignment. I pretty much guarantee it. I've run a number of these, and so far, knock wood, we've always seen a lot of commonality. And while we may have some things we disagree on, we can focus on that commonality because, frankly, there's a lot of work to do in any community, and focusing on the commonality gives us common ground we can work towards. So that's what we're looking for as an outcome of this. We'll then begin with our Open Design Studio to actually work through some of the design challenges of specific sites, of specific places, and make sure that we understand how things could happen in those places. We have this talent in town, and so we often run lunch and learns during the lunch hour. We invite people to come on over and listen to a little conversation about the state of the art in thinking about transportation planning, or the state of the art in regulating development, or perhaps in this community be a discussion of historic preservation, or it might be a discussion of startup businesses. Heaven knows what it might be. We'll have figured out by the time we get to this event what it can be. But really what it is an opportunity to listen to and talk to and engage with some of these experts who are in town. In the midweek, we are likely to have a check-in exercise. This is showing you one that we did in Amherst, New York, just outside of Buffalo, where literally we were in about 5 locations throughout the community. One of them happened to be a men's shop. I think you got one down the street here, Barclays. You know, you could imagine this taking place in the front of Barclays there, giving people a chance to come in and comment on some of the ideas and the conversations about a specific portion of town, for example. There will then on Thursday be a closing presentation. We always call it a work in progress presentation because we're not done at that point. We are done with the charrette week, but there's much more work to be done. But we should have a pretty strong idea of what we're going to propose for the framework for thinking about the transportation and the zoning, and how those two kind of come together. Before that experience, we are open to taking additional comments. Chris Schmiesing is our point of liaison. He's the easiest person to get to. Clearly, you can, send a note to the mayor or your ward councilor or whoever you want. It will eventually work its way through the system to us, but Chris is the best direct content. And we have the website CodePIQUA.com. So this website right now is in its infant stages. There's not a ton of information, but there's an explanation of what the project's about. And then as each deliverable gets posted, they will all be here. So that even if somebody comes in on the last meeting of the project, they'll be able to look at all of that project history and be able to look at all of the documents that